And this is all about creating impact. That is the fundamental goal of how to make your art have impact and emotional appeal. And to be successful, you have to play every note right. More than right notes.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology.
I'm wondering if a good place to start is if I could just ask you to share a little bit about what you do.
Most certainly. So my life consists of performing as an accordionist and a digital accordionist. That's probably 60% of what I do. I teach a little bit at the University of Toronto, a music business course to help students understand finances, negotiation, etc. I said that performing is only 60% of my time because probably the remaining 20% is admin, or actually it's probably more than that. So a touring freelance lifestyle supported by all the things that have to go into that.
I'm just going to assume that, like myself, most of the listeners and the readers who happen across this by accident don't know a ton about the accordion. I did try to educate myself a little bit last night as I was preparing for this. So I know like two things more that I did beforehand, but I do want to get to practice and performance related stuff eventually, but maybe a couple things that we could do before then just to kind of orient ourselves and everyone around this is, one, your origin story, and then two, a little bit about the accordion. I understand that you were maybe 5 when your mom found this accordion at a garage sale and brought it back for you and eventually led to lessons and so forth. But I'm just kind of curious, maybe this is typical in Canada where 5-year-olds get accordions from garage sales, but I mean, was it love at first sight? Like you just heard the sounds, it's like, oh, this is amazing? Or did it sound terrible and like you needed some time to grow into it? Or what was that like for you?
I don't remember, to be 100% honest, but I think I was pretty into the sound. I was also playing piano at the time. My earliest memories are of the community around it, actually, because in Western Canada, I grew up in Calgary. There were tons of festivals where I would go every summer and fall, compete in every category, meet all the other kids who were doing it. And to your question, no, there are not a lot of kids, but there were a few of us. And we had a strong community, and I had like 100 adopted grandparents who were just the most wonderful and supportive people who I'd see all the time. And that was contrasted, maybe we can talk about this later, with the piano where everyone was, don't talk to me, I'm wearing my white gloves before I play. But accordion was just totally the opposite. So I think the love at first sight maybe came from the community, because back then I was playing relatively simple folk music compared to the complexity of some music that I attempt to play now, are relatively straightforward. So it's really changed in terms of what I play on accordion over the years. And the classical music and Bach and all of that was definitely love at first sight when I tried to start doing it and couldn't do it when I was because it was way too hard. So if that answers your question a bit.
Yeah, and it's very easy for me to, I think, go off on different tangents following these different threads in different places. And so I don't want to do that, but I do want to ask about this idea of the difference that you felt in the community around the accordion versus the piano. It sounds like it was a much more supportive and welcoming community that you experienced in the accordion, even amongst peers, other kids your age that were doing this. Does that type of community remain to this day, or has it changed at all?
Funnily enough, in the last 3 or 4 years, I have received random Facebook messages from people that I haven't spoken to since I was 13. It's happened like at least 10 times recently, and people that I used to compete against getting back in touch. Their lives have gone away from, out of that crowd. I'm the only professional accordionist now, basically, apart from one. But I think it made me have this perception about music being a really community-oriented thing. And that is something that now I realize I really emphasize in concerts. With my 2 groups and also solo, I talk about, I even read this one Carl Sagan quote sometimes, the pale blue dot quote, if you're familiar with it, talking about how the earth is the only home we have as humanity. We are more similar than we are distinct and different from each other, and that we should really raise the level of empathy on this planet, be more kind to each other, etc. And to really, and that probably goes back to my childhood experiences with music, that music can be that way, and it doesn't have to be a stiff, difficult environment. And whenever I do feel in a stiff and difficult environment, an adversarial environment, it's much harder to perform well. Of course, going to maybe our central topic, that, your framing of a situation and feeling good about it. And if you can make a mental shift to kind of take control, or to feel that it's a friendly living room environment, even if there's 1,000 people in front of you, that really makes a big difference.
That is probably a terrific place to transition into the gist of what I wanted to chat with you about today. But I do want to ask, just kind of like the Cliff's Notes version of Accordion 101,
Sure.
Just so everyone has a sense of primarily how does it work? What are the physical or technical challenges involved? So, I mean, in terms of how it works, note production, dynamics, what are the right and left hands doing? Does the velocity of your fingers, like it would on a piano, like an acoustic piano, change at all what comes out of it? Or is it more like a digital piano where it doesn't really matter what the touch is?
Absolutely. So acoustic accordion has up to about 800 reeds inside of it. They are little strips of metal, kind of like a match, that's in a metal frame, and then the reed is anchored at one end, the bottom end, and then it can vibrate back and forth like your finger kind of twitching backwards and forwards through that opening. And which reed vibrates is determined by which button you push, and therefore which valve opens. So you think of there's 106 buttons on the right hand, 120 on the left hand, and think of those as the reed selectors, like which valve is getting opened. And then once you've selected the note you want, everything else, or largely everything else, is determined by the bellows. So you have to pull. If you don't pull or push and create a pressure differential, there's no sound at all. So the real big difference between accordion and piano, because a lot of people compare them, particularly the type of accordion that has a piano keyboard on it. We call that piano accordion. I started with that. Now mine has buttons on both sides, actually. But people think it's like a stomach Steinway or a belly Baldwin. We even have these expressions. And the functionality of the instrument could not be more different. Piano has the loudest sound at the beginning of the note. It's a struck percussive instrument. Accordion can swell within the note, and you do that by all sorts of manipulations of the bellows. You can do ha, which you can't do on piano. And we also have different reed banks. For anyone familiar with organ, we have like different octaves that you can connect with different stops to make up to 4 different sounds on the right hand and up to 3 different sounds at the same time on the left hand. Like one finger equals 4 reeds. So you can layer different octaves and get interesting effects. And you mentioned one really interesting thing, which is finger attack. When you're a student, you're taught finger attack doesn't matter at all. You just have to pull the bellows, because this isn't a piano, this is an accordion, so pull. But actually, later in my studies at the University of Toronto, my professor, Joseph Massarolo, he kept commenting about, use your wrist, use your fingers and all of that in certain scenarios. And then I started to notice that you can really change the sound by hitting the keyboards under certain circumstances in order to generate like a shock through the instrument that kind of activates the reeds and gets them speaking. Otherwise, they can be overwhelmed if you pull too hard without giving enough of a shock to activate them. And when you're playing, for example, in front of a symphony orchestra, you have to make a big sound that cuts through. And sometimes that's, strangely enough, the thing you're told not to do as a student is what you need to do in a controlled way later on. And then on digital accordion, which I also have here, and which I play quite a bit, it's a computerized accordion. It looks the same, but the guts are a computer rather than 800 reeds. Their finger attack matters very much because there's pressure sensitivity under every button. So when I started playing that about 10 years ago, I had to relearn how to use my fingers, because all of a sudden, any unevenness in how hard I hit, which didn't matter really before, now I control sounds that way. So I had to do a bit of rewiring upstairs in order to get that under control. So that's the 2-minute version.
Nice. Yeah. So I had a question about the bellows, maybe just personal curiosity. One, does it matter in terms of sound production whether you are pulling apart or pushing together? Like, is the sound exactly the same, or are there nuances and differences based on if it's going one direction or the other?
So it's the same note. There are some accordions where it's actually a different note on the pull and push, same button, like a harmonica. But concert accordions have the same note. Nuance, there's a tiny, tiny little bit of difference. I would say it's about like up bow, down bow on a string instrument, where opening the bellows is with gravity, so that's the equivalent of down bow, and it just has a little bit more gravity to it, a little bit more, and you can battle physics and try to make both equally as smooth as violinists do in order to get a smooth tone all the time. But there is a 98% similarity, but a 2% difference for sure.
In that sense, I wondered too if, like a wind or brass player or singer, do you need to be mindful of when you push versus when you pull? As in, you need to kind of pace yourself in one direction so that you don't run out of air before you get to the end of the phrase or something like that? Or does it not really matter? You can kind of like change bows, as it were, anywhere in the phrase.
You do need to think about when you're going to change, for sure. The amount of time, unless you're playing very loud with a lot of reeds, my bellows are longer than a bow, I'll put it that way, where you can play for maybe up to 30 seconds if it's very soft on one without changing the directions. So you have to watch out for that. But it's interesting where you breathe, like you with your internal lungs rather than your accordion external lungs, that can affect things as well. And thinking of the music, thinking of your own body management. Actually, part of one of the interviews I did for my thesis, I spoke to an amazing accordionist in Europe, Claudio Iacomucci. And he said one time he actually ran this experiment. He said, okay, I've done a lot of Alexander technique. I think I'm a very calm person. So I'm going to check how well I breathe while I play to see if I'm actually relaxed. So he said, okay, I'll play Barrio Sequenza, and I'll put a little head-worn microphone on, and I'll just record my breathing. And then afterwards he listened to it back, and he was expecting, and it was actually... like the whole way through. So he realized that he had to work on that, and that he wasn't as calm as he could be.
That would be an interesting experiment, I think, for string players, pianists, for all sorts of folks to try, actually, just to see if our breathing maps onto the phrasing and what we're trying to do in any coordinated sort of way, because I would imagine that it probably doesn't much of the time.
He found it didn't. He used this nice word. He said it was a polymetry with sometimes it was 2 versus 3, sometimes it was unrelated, sometimes it was very in sync, but it kind of morphed. But as long as you keep breathing, I think that's the important thing.
That probably starts to get us closer to some of the ideas that I wanted to explore. A lot of times different musicians get nervous about different things that are somewhat aligned with their instruments, right? So oboists worry about their reeds, and string players worry about shaky bow. And I'm just wondering, what do accordionists, as a general rule, perhaps tend to get nervous about or worry about?
Probably one or two things. Where I would go to answer that question is my left hand. The left hand is strapped onto the accordion, and it's also, the left arm is operating the bellows. So it's already pretty busy. You have very limited use of the thumb. You can use it a tiny bit, but it's kind of a 4-finger hand, 4.5. Whereas the right hand can be super virtuosic. It's very free. The left hand is already busy, and it's the left hand. I'm right hand dominant, so it's my weaker hand. And the buttons are smaller, so there's a whole bunch of factors that kind of work against you. And you also can never see it. No accordionist has ever seen their left hand, and I've tried mirrors. That doesn't help. Whereas the right hand, you can kind of look over top and glance down, and if you have a big jump, you can look. So I fear certain things on left hand, and when composers write very difficult, complex left hand parts that are basically like another right hand part, or where they write for accordion as if it were a piano, if they don't have that much experience, you get a lot of people who do that. It can be too difficult to do something good musically. And I sometimes reorganize voices a little bit to try to get maybe a 40-60 distribution of activity to the right hand. It shouldn't really be 50-50. So managing that is a little tricky. And also, I learned it as a teenager. I didn't learn that when I was 5. It's a different keyboard system. So it took me, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years. I would start by playing like Bach preludes and fugues on stage around that time. And one time I screwed up so badly, I had to improvise my way back to the previous cadence, and then it tied into memory blocks in the moment because my adrenaline went through the roof. And then I couldn't figure out where to go. I'd loop back, try again, screw up in the same, loop back, try again, eventually get through it. And then I had trauma from trying to play polyphonic Baroque music for years, which is one of my favorite things to play. And I don't know, I think it was 5 years before I could get myself out of that rut. Even if I played it okay on stage, I was really on edge on the inside for years.
Can I just ask a little bit about how you did that, actually?
Like that process?
Yeah. It might be something that happened by accident or something intentional, but I am kind of curious how you managed to because I think it's something that happens to a lot of musicians. And
yeah, that was definitely my biggest block that plagued me for a while. I think time was the first ingredient. Number 2, and repetition. And as scary as it was not giving up, after that first crash and burn, I did so, I don't know, 5 or 10 more times on stage. And I tried to pick low pressure performances in order to try to build up some stamina again, reintroducing music. So I wasn't doing it from memory, because before then I always played everything by memory. That made it a little more secure. Then I think also learning how to better manage my bellows. That's probably because that's the heart of tone production on accordion. And if you zero in on just the issue that's happening, and we could talk about that too, specific techniques. I also got better at that, how to isolate problems and really zero in and only practice the bit that you need to and nothing else, and get it only right while you're practicing by going super slow and writing all the fingers, all that. But also improving your general instrument handling, because accordion is very heavy. It's 35 pounds up to, and it's a real problem of managing the instrument, particularly when it's big, when it's expanded. So wrapping your mind around how to improve your technique and improve your body handling of it, I think that's probably what made the difference for me, both in confidence, where I felt more grounded with the instrument on stage, because it was never a fingering problem. I was always capable of doing the things with my fingers in isolation. It was maybe a confidence or a focus problem to be able to get through the whole thing in one arc on stage. So I don't know, not a perfect answer, but lots of little things, I think.
No, I think that's probably the best answer, that it wasn't one thing that you did, but it took a little bit of time changing your experience on stage, and each time going on stage, having a different set of modifications or adjustments or tweaks or improvements and increased comfort with your instrument physically as well as perhaps mentally, with different cues and so forth, that built up this new narrative or this new belief in yourself and your ability to handle something that did not work out for you at an earlier point in time.
May I insert one more word? Grounding. Like with your feet, with your breathing and all of that, I'm realizing now, but also, as I said earlier, with maybe a little bit more gravity of the hands on the keyboards, which in theory doesn't affect the sound, but it can actually make you feel much more connected to your instrument.
This might be somewhat related to that, but I was intrigued in your dissertation by a number of things. But one thing that I think immediately stood out was this idea of expressive virtuosity versus impressive virtuosity. I just wonder if you could, it's something that I think would resonate with all musicians, even if we haven't used those terms. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about it and what the differences really between those two are for you.
I'd love to. As I was preparing and writing my thesis, I was trying to articulate what was missing from people who play with tremendous technical capability, but are a little bit flat in terms of their emotional delivery on stage. Like, why do we want to listen to one person versus another? And it's usually not their technique. If assuming that there's no issues for either one. So I was speaking with my professor, Joe Massarolo, about, he called it physiological virtuosity, which we could summarize as body management in the broad sense, controlling the instrument and controlling your body and using many different intentional techniques. For example, if I'm going to do a legato touch, how do you do it? Let's get into the micro, like how does the finger roll, and let's analyze that. And he's a master of that and of using the bellows in very specific motions that many people haven't gotten into that level of thought about. So that was the kernel for this. And I was trying to call it physiological virtuosity, and people were saying, what's that? And I said, well, it's the opposite of impressive virtuosity. And they said, well, okay, we kind of understand that. Impressive virtuosity, that's what you hear in a lot of competitions. Fast and loud playing, basically. Competitive playing, where it's just arpeggio after arpeggio on the hardest technical pieces, but there's no gravity somehow. So then one of my supervisors proposed expressive virtuosity, and I was like, aha, that's exactly what I mean. So expressive virtuosity for me is the tools and the knowledge and the body management that an artist acquires over time in order to be able to be sensitive to their musical environment, to be in total control of their instrument, and to be able to make it sound like more than what it is. In accordion, that would mean orchestrating on any instrument, actually. It could mean orchestrating. How can you imitate the tone of a bassoon? The bop, 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 bop. How do you get that touch? Or how do you imitate the grandeur of an organ on accordion? What exactly do you have to do with your body in order to do that? And if you are an expressive virtuoso, then you've mastered all of those things, and you can adapt what you're doing in an appropriate way for any musical circumstance. And I think that this is, to me, the real defining trait of a virtuoso. And of course, it has to come with great physical dexterity and technical capabilities in the minimum sense as well. Otherwise, you may not be able to pull that off. But it's the extra it factor, special ingredient that makes somebody so interesting to listen to because they're so aware.
And I think your dissertation gets into some of the specific ingredients around what that might entail or involve. I'm wondering, though, and maybe there's not a straightforward answer to this, but how does one practice for expressive virtuosity? Because it seems like there would need to be at least at the very minimum, like a different intention during your practice in order to be aiming towards that as opposed to just the physiological or impressive virtuosity that you described.
I think so. I have broken technique into two components, often, broadly speaking, which I call intention and realization. The point of that is to communicate that a technique is half a mental thing, like to know what you want to do. Technique isn't just the artist painting on the canvas, it's also the idea of what do they want to do and the knowledge of, let me give an example. If I want to paint a sky on a canvas, do you start from the top? Do you start from the bottom? You have to have that experience. I have no idea how to paint a good sky, but I imagine there are things to say about that. And if you've tried them all, and if you really know, I think that is part of technique, because the ideas of what you can do are related to your physical capabilities. Like your intentions are related to your physical experience, and vice versa, where a more sophisticated intention leads you to make different physical discoveries. So practicing in this way, I think, does require a lot of imagination. You have to imagine yourself on the concert hall stage continuously and projecting your tone into the space. As Geyer Druxfall, a great accordionist, said, he likes to imagine projecting his tones right up into the corners, the top left and right corners of the concert hall. And if he thinks he can get it there, then he thinks he fills the room. But he really imagines that the whole time. And then there's also the matter of timing, pacing. You call it any of these, where the most important thing, I think, about delivering a performance, the final phase of a performance, is to find the timing, or one could even say the flow, where time and flow integrated into that. These are other words from my prof, Joseph Massarolo, that he uses to describe this, where once you get those elements right and balanced, then you are sensitive to your space, you're sensitive to the audience. You know, if somebody coughs during a rest, you might take a second longer to come in. Like, always responding to your environment and being 100% in the moment is, so practicing that way, I think, is what gets you to that level of sensitivity.
There were a few quotes that actually really kind of struck me in your paper, and I'm tempted to read some of them back to you to get your reaction. Some of them were quotes that your teacher said at some point, and you'd put in there. One of them had to do with how a wrong note played correctly was preferable to a right note played incorrectly. I wonder if you could say more about that.
Every note has many ingredients to it. What pitch it is just one of them. And if I say, okay, let's do pop, okay, that was a note. It was a whatever note, I guess that was the pitch. But it had a lot more to it than that. It was a short note. It was a light note. I didn't scream. It had a pop, like I kind of put a P at the end. There, I'm going up in pitch. Where it had a lightness to the ending. It had a soft beginning. It wasn't a top, like if with a different consonant, with a T at the beginning. So there was a lightness to the beginning and the end. And so I'm just pointing out parameters that every single note has. And like a beginning music student, we only worry about what is the note. Is it an F? Is it an F sharp? And on accordion, side note, we play so many notes because you can. So we play a lot of notes. So we often get bogged down in the volume of information that we're dealing with. But when you really zero in, every note has to have all these parameters. And we haven't even yet talked about the parameters of the note related to others around it and how it fits into a context. So for one note, there's so much to say. So if you get all of those characteristics right about the note, and you play a brilliant run and one note happens to be wrong, but it has all the right characteristics, it won't interrupt the flow. But if none of the notes have exactly the right feel, even if they're correct, it won't have an emotional impact on people. And this is all about creating impact. That is That is the fundamental goal of how to make your art have impact and emotional appeal. And to be successful, you have to play every note right. More than right notes.
A lot of what you wrote about in this section reminded me of something that I think it was a video of Leon Fleischer where he was talking about how between rhythm, harmony, and melody, rhythm, he said, was by far the most important of the three.
Totally.
And I'm inclined to agree with anything that Fleischer says, so without question. But still, when I thought about it, I could see where he was coming from, and that made sense to me. And it seemed like that's what you were getting at as well. This one thing I think I'll read here that you wrote was, generally, the audience should be allowed sufficient time to process musical events unless the goal is to overwhelm them with musical cacophony. Helping the listener to understand the pacing of a crescendo and even to anticipate where the music is going before it happens makes the arrival all the more satisfying for them. Managing the timing of expectations is important. Musical communication involves both the impulse from the performer and its reception by the audience, which seemed related to something that your teacher also said about, I think related to horizontal playing versus vertical playing, and the idea of cheating across bar lines and across notes. And there was even a section where I loved where you sort of drew on top of the phrase where the dynamic high points and swells and such actually would transpire, which were not necessarily aligned with the black and white printing of the crescendo and the forte placement and so forth. And then you actually showed when you played the phrase the right way, in a way that was most musically convincing and compelling, based on the sound waves that you overlaid on top of the phrase, you could see how it's like we can't follow the verticality of where the dynamics are printed directly for the music to be the most impactful. Like we actually need to kind of read between the lines and interpret it and actually use that as a starting point to give us a sense of the general placement of where these things happen. But yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit about this idea of vertical versus horizontal playing.
Oh, 1,000,000%. The accordion, everything that you feel when you're pulling on the bellows, it's a hugely tactile experience to play accordion. And the bellows are basically, unless you play flat, they're in a continuous state of crescendo or decrescendo. So you're literally feeling that tension happen. So I would suggest it's a very good instrument for understanding where the tension points are and exactly where to put them. And it's very counterintuitive. As you just highlighted, I did that experiment of trying to record good and bad examples of a crescendo. And it turns out that actually, first of all, saving the crescendo for the very end to make it kind of delayed and then exponential sounds way better. And that's not a secret. Plenty of musicians and pedagogues do mention that. But one thing that's particularly, I think, maybe more important on accordion is to swell through the arrival of the next, of the apex. As my professor says, play through it, which means don't stop crescendoing on the arrival note. Keep crescendoing just a little bit longer. And if you think about it, like if you were on violin and you play a big swell up to a high note, well, right after you start to play the high note, then vibrato starts to kick in if you then have a long note. So we don't generally do that on accordion, but there's some blossoming of the note after it arrives that naturally occurs on many voice as well, where vibrato is added to the note, maybe not with a great delay, but the note continues to develop after the arrival. And that's the real key, to not hit the note and stop and then just be flat. So that means that ultimately the bellows and the crescendo have to be disconnected from the bar line, where, okay, here's the beat. If we only swell that far and then do it according to the bar line, then it's less satisfying than disconnecting it and actually continuing to go and making the bellows a little bit more free from the verticality of what's happening with the rhythm of the notes. So really, it's hard to do because the student wants to coordinate everything they do with their body so that all events happen at the same time and then they're done. But actually, in truth, it's better when things are a little bit mixed up. It's way more human.
Not to put you on the spot, but this seems like the sort of thing that, since we have video, would be kind of awesome to be able to demonstrate. Is there any chance you might be able to like play a little chunk of music, playing it, I don't want to say correctly, but like playing it in accordance to kind of the verticality of how the music is written, and then again playing it the way that would be more expressive and more effective by thinking about the phrase outside of the sort of vertical structure that is written on the page?
Absolutely. Let's use just a simple melody, Moon River, maybe. I'll do it without accompaniment first. So here are the notes. So that's just, I tried to do flat bellowing. If anyone was listening really closely, there was one note that was less perfect legato than others. And I'll say that so that people really listen for it. Reason I say it is when I'm being less expressive with the bellows, I find that my articulation is much less good. It's far less even. So let me do it again. And now I'm going to add crescendos that coincide with note heads. Let me try again. I think I can do it worse. I would call that what I just did pianistic, because none of the notes had internal dynamics. I just made the G, and then the D was just suddenly louder. That's a basic phrasing. Now let's add a crescendo in the G up to the point that the D happens. So, and I'll make it kind of a linear crescendo. Okay, yeah, let's just use 3 notes. That's all we need. So crescendo in the G even. Now let's make it an exponential crescendo. So I'll delay the crescendo until the end and then kind of hit the D. That would be my best attempt at that. Now I'll do what I said I should do all along, which is crescendo with a bit of a delay and then continue to crescendo after the start of the D. Is that coming through?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let me try it one more time. So the actual pressure point, I'll tap my accordion. Da, da, da. It's about when I slapped there. So if I put that in context now with some accompaniment, I'll just play a little bit. And if you listen for those ha moment after the notes, let's try this. Okay, here it is with some accompaniment. Did that come through okay?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was terrific.
So maybe that's just a small little demo of disconnecting the dynamics from the note heads.
And I like that word that you use, internal dynamics of a note, because I think you're right. I think when we're young, we're just worried, did I play the right note at the right time, basically? And then eventually start even adding dynamics to it. But we don't really think that much about the precision of the dynamics so much. It's a crescendo in this general area. We don't think about the crescendo within the notes, or as I've heard some musicians talk about, the life within each note. And even for pianists, I think those who are really aware of this do manage to create a really compelling illusion of what's happening between the notes and within the notes, even if they don't actually have much control over it, which maybe is also related a bit to, I mean, you talked in your dissertation about those four key elements of, I think, time, tone, flow, and space. And I don't know if space was related to the body language portion of it, but I thought it was really cool that you acknowledged the importance of being mindful of how you're communicating physically, aside from just the production of what it is that you want on the instrument. I wonder if you could say more about that as well, in terms of what that means, or how that looks, or how that's part of your preparation as well.
Absolutely. For me, I really care a great deal, not only about the playing, but also about what I say on stage, about stage presence, about lighting, sound. I usually play amplified so that you can get all sorts of parameters of sound projected out into the hall. So for me, performing is there are a lot of things that I try to bring together. One of them is visual delivery, because, I think it's 70% of our sensory input is from our eyes. And even in a concert, we really hear what we see. And we even, you can even create expectations visually and then satisfy them sonically. Or you can do the opposite, create an expectation and then defy it. Like you build a very pregnant pause with your body and then wait. And then you can create a moment of humor right before you actually do play. So, I mean, there's so much you can do when you involve the body and the visuals. I don't want to suggest to every musician is completely different, and to use your face as a performance tool is something that some people do very naturally and others kind of don't like to do. Accordion, like your face is looking straight at everybody. You're not like a pianist who's looking sideways. So all you have is this big instrument and then your head bobbling on top of it. You can't move very much because you're preoccupied with the instrument. So really kind of your head is the only free bit that you have. So I think maybe that's why I feel that expressing things with my head and face works well on accordion, at least, because it's the only thing that's possible. That's, by the way, a slightly to the side definition of what my professor meant by space. He was referring more to filling the room with sound, adapting to the reverb of that particular concert hall, listening to the musicians around you, feeling the pacing of how you are delivering to the audience and responding to it. And all of those parameters very much relate to what I just said as well. But just wanted to make that note too.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something that you had said earlier that I did want to follow up on, and I might not be able to articulate this exactly right, but in this concept of space, it seems that there is very much an awareness of the audience and the energy and the engagement and the acoustics and so forth. You also talked about being present in the moment. I'm wondering how all this, because it's very possible to be overly concerned with the audience in a way that takes you out of the present moment and the creating of music in that moment. How do you stay in the present, stay engaged with the task at hand and what you're trying to create and say with the music, while being attentive to the audience and kind of tying all those things together?
It's interesting. You're not the first person who has said something similar to that to me, including my own duo partner in my duo Bridge and Wolak with the clarinetist Cornel Wolak. He is often of the mind that the two of us should interact and that observing our dynamic is what the audience will find interesting. Rather than playing for the audience, we should play for each other. Forget about them. And some pieces I find absolutely that going deep in that way works really well, particularly any longer work, anything more than 4 or 5 minutes, and you can kind of get into that space. I do think that some shorter works in particular, if they're lighter or if they're humorous, I tend not to go that deep and I'm still playing kind of for the audience, but there are different scenarios and certainly different things that are appropriate. If you're playing a whole concerto, you have to be doing it for you and for your musical colleagues on stage, and the audience is a witness to that. I think that one of the beautiful things about a live concert experience is that it is one of the very few events now in the digital world where it's so analog. And if you go as an audience member, you cannot speed up the YouTube video. You can't skip ahead. You have to endure the entire slow movement. You can't just skip to the virtuoso part at the end. Not that anyone would necessarily want to do that. But you have to endure it. And I mean that word kindly, that you kind of submit yourself to the experience, the temporal experience of how long is this concert going to be? And I'm going to be here until it's over. You know, kind of how long it is, but not exactly. And we're all in this together. Every audience member is experiencing it in that way. And that's one of the very few times that we do that in society these days in large numbers. And perhaps you've even read some of the studies. I think there was one last fall that came out I think it was in Berlin. An orchestra played some Brett Dean, some Brahms, and something else. And they put heart rate monitors on people and they put breathing monitors on people. And they saw that there was quite a bit of syncing up. Heart rate with the flow of the music, breathing, because we are sympathetic organisms. When you're, 2 feet away from the next human, whether you know them or not, your body responds to them, to their adrenaline, to their tension, to their calmness, whatever it may be. And so that's really where, it's an argument for the value of live music and for the experience of that. But I think it's a really beautiful thing to have a mass of people together. And side topic, I think it's really a different experience when the hall is packed, no matter what size of hall it is. Because if people are really spread out, you say something musically or you say something verbally, and I find the experience of how the audience responds to it is very different. If the hall is 80% full or more, people are tightly packed enough that they respond as a unit rather than as individual, and they kind of bounce off of each other and respond the same way as the person next to them. It's like how comedians find it much easier to tell jokes in a packed hall. I know that's an aside. I think there's something there that about how audiences become sympathetic to their neighbors.
That probably would have been the best place to end this episode, honestly. But there's something that I wanted to ask, so I'm just going to stick it in here anyway.
Sure.
My impression is that the accordion is a relatively physical instrument. The first thing I thought about when I just watched it was have this partial rotator cuff tear, and all I can think about is like all the external rotation of the shoulder, on the left side would for me be a challenge. But this spoke to, I think, somebody that you interviewed in the process of completing your dissertation, who started speaking about the purpose of a warm-up routine. I think now that I'm older, going to the gym, I do have to emphasize warm up and cool down, whereas for many years I didn't bother. And even playing the instrument, didn't worry about warming up really, just sort of went through the motions of it without really having any particular intention behind it. But yeah, you talked about it being a way to connect the brain to the body, and that made a lot of sense in that it's a way, it seems, to prepare yourself to be able to make the most of the practicing that you do afterwards, even though I think a lot of times we don't feel like we have time for that. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit and maybe share a little bit about how you get warmed up. And you used a phrase earlier that I've heard amongst some musicians as well, this idea of, especially, before an audition or before a performance, the value of doing what you need to stay or get connected to your instrument. So it doesn't mean playing what you're about to play on stage. It could be other things that you do to get connected to your instrument. But those seem to be connected, at least in my mind. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Well, since writing that and doing that research, my warm-up routine has kind of crystallized, and I do something pretty similar fairly frequently, which is I start, and it's really boring. I always play A and E in the bass, open fifth, like a drone. And maybe there's value to a drone specifically. It's a calming, long frequency, and maybe that would work on other instruments too. And then I improvise chords with the right hand, but with both hands. Absolutely anything I can think of that works over those notes, and some things that don't. And it's very slow. And I could even improvise a little bit of it for you if you'd like. And I just go through a few minutes of that and really think about the bellows expanding all the way and then coming back. So bellows, drone calms you down. And I am a pretty harmonic thinker. I'm a much better harmonic thinker than a melodic thinker as far as musicians go. And I'm very aware of that all the time. And that's what keeps me grounded in the music that I'm playing. So activating the harmonic processing, if you will, by improvising the craziest chords I can come up with, I think that switches my brain on and gets me thinking creatively and feeling good and enjoying my instrument and wanting to pick it up. And sometimes I just do that. And then sometimes practicing a piece follows very naturally out of that. But it's about finding the creative space, because work, like practicing, can become work so quickly if you only ever do the thing required of you. And the better practicer you are, the more you know, I need to only do the hard spot. And like, it's really hard and exhausting to practice well because you only ever do the things you can't do yet. So having that creative side activated, I think, is a big part of generating musical play and being ready for it. And then maybe it improves your whole mindset around practice. So it's about activating the body, activating your connection to the instrument, the interface, and then also about activating your creativity, I think.
That would be an excellent way, actually, to end this episode, if we can fade out with you just warming up, basically doing the sort of thing that you would do to prepare yourself for practice.
Sure. I don't think this has ever been filmed. Well, in case we don't say anything else, thank you for having me.
And thank you for being here as well and taking the time to share this with us.
I should say this is from Claudio Iacomucci in my paper. He was the one that suggested this and started showing me this, so credit to him.